industry, and an 8 trillion of that is demand for its use as a store of value. Money, the marketability aspects of money boils down to 5 services that money can render. Money needs to be divisible, it needs to be durable, it needs to be recognizable, it needs to be portable, and it needs to be scarce. So I'll gloss over a lot of history with this and just say that historically, money's always been a technology, still is a technology or a tool. I use these terms interchangeably, and you think of a technology as just a more sophisticated tool, effectively.
Mm-hmm.
To best satisfy those properties, monetary metals were determined to be the most satisfactory tool, the most divisible, most durable, most recognizable, most portable tool in the marketplace. Of the monetary metals, gold was the most scarce, as quantified by either its stock to flow ratio or its inflation resistance. So, simple way to say this is that people always prefer the money most resistant to inflation.
That's a nice definition of scarcity in the context of money is, if you were to measure it, the resistance to inflation. So how hard is it to artificially increase the supply of the thing?
That is the hardness of money. And that's why gold is hard money.
Because alchemy is hard.
That's right. Because no one cracked alchemy, so gold became money.
So, that's such a nice, clean explanation of what is money with the 5 elements, and gold ultimately won out because of the last piece of scarcity.
That's right. And to get to maybe dig a little deeper there. So scarcity, we commonly think of scarcity as strictly a supply property, where if there's not much of something, then it's scarce. But it's not actually true. Scarcity occurs when demand exceeds supply. So when there's more demand than the supply can justify, the thing becomes an economic good, and it establishes itself a market price. So there's more demand for the thing than the supply can satisfy. The unique thing about money, as a concept at least, is that demand always exceeds supply.
Mm-hmm.
There's never enough money to satisfy everyone, right? Because another definition for money, it's the most marketable good. So it can be traded for any other good, service, piece of knowledge in the marketplace.
Mm-hmm.
So humans being what we are, we're never satisfied, right? We always want more of something, whatever it may be. So money as the ultimate token of obtaining that something is always scarce as a concept. But the problem with money is that if you can, as you alluded to, easily increase its supply, then all of a sudden you can compromise the scarcity of it over time, and you can rob people through inflation.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why the market settled on gold as money.
And robbing is reallocating the value so essentially the one property, like why scarcity is important is it adds a lot more friction to the reallocation, like through essentially violence or implied violence.
Well, it prevents it through cost of extraction too. So if you want to go out and dilute gold holders today, you have to go out into the world and mine gold. It's a very expensive process. That process tends to find equilibrium where production cost equals the market value of gold. So if market value is $2,000 an ounce today of gold, its production cost is going to be around there. That's the natural market equilibrium. So that way, gold miners cannot just dilute people over time. Whereas if you look at something like fiat currency, we're jumping ahead a little bit, but its production cost is zero. So there's a reason the market value of fiat currency historically has always converged to zero, because its production cost is near zero. So the extension to that question might be, how did we get from gold to paper currency? And again, this is rooted in the properties of money. As good as monetary metals were, and as good as gold is as money at holding value across time, it's rather limited in terms of portability. It is not as useful for moving value across space. This is another definition of money, by the way, a social device for moving value across space and time.
Mm-hmm.
So to rectify this technological shortcoming of gold, we introduced, first of all, the custody of gold was gradually centralized into fewer and fewer warehousing operations. This is because there are economies of scale associated with using gold as money, and that if you centralize the custody, the warehouse owner can then issue a paper receipt called a warehouse receipt for that gold, and then market participants can trade that paper as if it's good as gold, and everyone has an option at any time to go and redeem real gold from the warehouse. So that system works until the problem with it is that it introduces the need to trust the custodian. So it's introducing counterparty risk in the form of the custodian. And now, should that warehouse choose to increase the supply of paper notes to gold beyond its supply, so if it's got 3 tons of gold and it issues 6 tons worth of paper receipts, all of a sudden it's participating in a fraud. It's basically lying. It's representing that it has more gold than it actually does. And that is the pathway that we got into banking and central banking, is we needed a convenience mechanism to rectify the portability shortcomings of gold. We needed to be able to move value across space, right? Gold was doing a great job at moving value over time, but not space. Paper currency gave us the ability to move value across space, but it introduced this attack vector for warehouse operators, which became banks, which became central banks, to modify the supply to suit their own political agendas.
Added the snooze button. That allows you to do a little fraud.
To get something
first.
for nothing.
Something, just a little bit at first.
Yeah.
Just this one morning, just a little bit. I mean, I don't know if you can speak to the birth of fiat currency. Is there some interesting characteristics to those early steps that created it? Like, could it have been averted, or is this the natural progression of governments?
You know what's funny is that central banking was initially designed to be the custodian of gold, right? So they were going to custody the gold, issue paper on top of it, and then they would maintain, you could trust the public stamp effectively. You could trust that the central bank had as much gold on reserve as they said they had, and they were supposed to be the trustworthy institution. So we went from placing our trust in a free market game theoretic process where we're trusting gold, and we began trusting this institution instead. That institution would not have arisen if the portability of gold was really high. If we could have somehow sent gold across a telecommunications channel, there would have been no need for a central bank. Everyone could have custodied their gold in any information-bearing medium, frankly, and they could beam it around the world at any time. So this whole institution itself is rooted in a technological shortcoming of gold. So I think it's another way to think about that is maybe had there been all the gold in the world today fills 2 Olympic-sized swimming pools. All the gold mined throughout all of human history. So there's not a lot, right?
Wow. Mm-hmm.
What if there had been just like way more? There'd just been, 20,000 Olympic swimming pools worth. Portability wouldn't have been as much of an issue, right? We could have, and this is to say, assuming gold was still the most scarce metal and all these things, portability would have been less of an issue. We would have had less dependence or need for a central bank. So I think it's kind of idiosyncratic in that we just happened to end up here on this planet with a certain amount of gold. It best satisfied the properties of money.
And a certain amount of humans geographically dispersed, such that portability had certain properties that you want to achieve for humans in the geographical space to be able to be a exchange value.
It became more of an issue as we globalized, right? As we became more of a global society, we needed money that could move across space really fast, right? So we could trade in international capital markets. So that drove the central bank to become the dominant institution of the world. And if you follow the flows of gold throughout history, I've been watching this documentary on World War I and World War II on Netflix. I think it's called World War II in Color.
Oh, yeah. This is really good.
It's so good. And when I say gold has been the governor of governments, or gold is geopolitical money, like it is the base layer operating system, has been the base layer operating system for analog society. Mm-hmm. So it's always been about who controls the gold. Is who makes the rules. And that's, in that context, is why Bitcoin is so interesting, because it is the disruptor to this base level operating system that's functioned for all of human history.
I think this is a good place to ask. We asked the what is money question.
Mm-hmm.
What is Bitcoin?
That's a question as complicated as what is money. I think if you get a general understanding of money from a number of angles, that we could say Bitcoin is the most superior monetary technology that has ever existed.
So one of the most superior implementation of the ideas of money that you talked about. You talked about money as speech. You talked
Yes.
about money as an idea. You talked about money as sovereignty.
Yeah. So we're attaching the concept of money, to your point, to whatever tool best satisfies those properties of money or best renders those services we need from money.
And as you said, you're using the word tool and technology interchangeably here.
Yes. And another thing to think about here is that we think often in terms of goods or services, but actually everything is a service. So it's not the physical properties of this pen that I find valuable. It's the services that it renders to me. That I want to write a letter. This serves me by allowing me to lay ink on paper and communicate information. So value, humans attach value, as we alluded to earlier, to services, not goods. So the properties or the services that money renders that human beings value are those 5 properties: divisibility, durability, recognizability, portability, scarcity. Metals best satisfied those services historically, but Bitcoin, as the most superior monetary technology in human history, essentially perfects them. It's as close to perfection as we've ever been. So in terms of divisibility, each Bitcoin can be broken down into 100 million subunits called a Satoshi. It could, if that divisibility were ever a problem, which actually, there was a question that came up recently. If you divide the world population by the total supply of Bitcoin, you end up at like 0.3 Bitcoin per person. Call it 300,000 Satoshis per person. What if that was not enough to facilitate economic activity? And the answer to that is Bitcoin can soft fork into further divisibility. So if Bitcoin ate all the money in the world and the average Bitcoiner wealth was, say, 300,000 Satoshis each, but that wasn't divisible enough maybe to buy coffee and do all these day-to-day transactions, what would happen? Well, we would increase its divisibility. So Bitcoin's perfected divisibility. The divisibility of money lets us transact across scales, right? We can buy coffee or we can buy a house. Durability is an interesting one. So clearly something like gold is very durable. It's resistant to degradation over time. Bitcoin is just pure information, but it's stored in a distributed format. So information stored in a distributed fashion tends to be virtually infinitely durable. The example I like to give here is something like the Bible. The Bible is just distributed information. It's stored everywhere and nowhere, so to speak. And for that reason, it has outlasted empires. And Bitcoin's similar, right? You can't make changes to it unilaterally.
But to make explicit, the ways in which it is not durable is the fact that it relies on computing infrastructure. Like it needs computers. So if you were to destroy all the computers in the world,
yes,
it needs mechanisms that store and transfer information.
That's right.
And so you could attack it. I mean, you could attack gold in the same kind of way, I suppose, through the physics, but it's probably easier to destroy all the computers in the world than it is to destroy all the gold in the world. Maybe not. I don't know. Anyway.
Yeah, you're right. Maybe I'm not sure which one would be harder to destroy. But the other thing is there's a dynamic incentive. So every time you destroy Bitcoin miners, you're creating incentives for anyone else with access to electricity to mine. Right. Because you're making the algorithm easier.
Well, so the destruction is difficult because of the decentralized nature of the whole thing.
And the difficulty adjustment.
Yeah. So you're going to have to use nuclear weapons and cover the whole globe. But anyway.
Yeah. And by then, we've got much bigger problems than money, right?
That's right. So, okay. So that's durability.
So portability, Bitcoin's pure information. It can move at the speed of light. Can't get much faster than that. Recognizability refers to the ability to verify the veracity of the money or its authenticity. So you can actually, when we used to transact gold, there were time-honored techniques for verifying that it was gold and not gold-plated lead, for instance. This is where we get the term sound money. A gold coin made a very particular sound when dropped from a certain height. You know, you've seen people biting coins. These are all techniques for testing the authenticity of gold. And with Bitcoin, we have something unique in that if you're running a full node, you can verify that the Bitcoin is Bitcoin, right? It cannot be tampered with. It cannot be faked. And in addition to that, as a node operator, you can audit the total supply of Bitcoin at any time, which is unlike any money in history. So you know with full certainty if you're holding 1,000 Bitcoin, you have 1,000 out of a possible 21 million forever. You have a guaranteed fraction of the total supply.
Yeah, so a full node contains information about every transaction that's ever been had, so you can figure out,
That's right.
all the truth of this money is all right there.
Yeah, it's like a fractal constituent of the whole network, right? The whole Bitcoin blockchain is comprised in a node too. Not the proof of work piece, but the entire transaction history. And so that's unique as well. And that's what makes Bitcoin the ultimate store of value, is that you know with certainty what the total supply is and will ever be. And you know that your share of that supply is fixed. It cannot change. It can only improve, actually. If someone loses, if the Satoshi stash is truly gone forever, the million Bitcoin never moves, then we're talking about 1,000 Bitcoin out of 20 million instead, and so on and so forth. As more people lose access to their Bitcoin, they're basically making a contribution to everyone else. It's anti-dilutive.
And there's certain properties of Bitcoin that are sort of a little bit more into the details that ensure that the full nodes, like the size of all the transactions that ever happened, at least currently, can be stored in a single computer, for example.
Yes.
So it doesn't blow up too quickly.
That's right.
But there's arguments that that's not necessary. You can make arguments for that to be a very nice property, but you can also say that there's like drawbacks to it. That's hence the block size debates and all those kinds of things.
Yeah, that was the Bitcoin Cash civil war, right? Was that particular piece?
Yeah,
and ostensibly they were saying, "Oh, we need more transaction throughput to buy more coffee and do more transactions," but what they were actually doing was increasing the size, computing power necessary to run a full node, which it would have theoretically compromised decentralization.
So yeah, but it would, in theory, in theory, it would allow you to have much more transactions.
That's right.
But the drawback, it would, because it no longer can be stored in a single personal computer, then it naturally leads to decentralization.
Yes.
Same kind of thing we see with gold.
Which would have compromised its survivability.
Right. Yeah. So what else is there?
The last one, which
Yes.
leads straight into this one, actually is the most important one of money, which is scarcity. And that you need to know the supply is fixed and safeguarded from counterfeiting and inflation, which counterfeiting and inflation are the same thing, by the way. Counterfeiting is criminalized inflation. Inflation is legalized counterfeiting. So central banks today, when they say they're printing money, they're not. They're counterfeiting currency. That's a very important part. And Bitcoin, as I've argued in some of my writing, is more than just an invention. It's actually the discovery of absolute scarcity, and that we have unveiled a property of money that we will only discover once. And it's got really major ramifications for the world at large. So with gold, for instance, as we've covered, it became money because it was the most relatively scarce monetary metal, right? Its supply was hardest to increase over time. However, if we could somehow flip a switch today and make everyone in the world go out and start mining gold, we could increase the supply much more quickly. We could, its historic inflation rate's about 2%. We could double that pretty quickly. With Bitcoin, it is not possible. So no matter how much effort and energy and capital and operational expenditure we pour into the mining network, we cannot deviate from its fixed and diminishing supply curve from between now and the last Bitcoin being mined in 2140 because of the difficulty adjustment. It's constantly it's adapting to human action, actually. So the harder we pursue it, the more that it recedes, and then the less we pursue it, the more available it makes itself. And it's a real major breakthrough because it's the closest thing to perfect information we've ever had in an economy. And perfect information is it's a theoretical but unattainable state of the market where all market actors have all the relevant information about everything so that they can compete as efficiently as possible. And in a state of pure information, perfect information, we have perfect competition. And in perfect competition, we maximize wealth generation. Mm-hmm. So we're competing as freely as possible from coercive and violent impediments. And so I think Bitcoin, in that sense, is going to pull the world closer to a state of perfect competition than we've ever been before, which would increase wealth generation to an extent we've never seen before.
Many of the things you said about Bitcoin also hold for other cryptocurrency technologies that followed after. Can you say something to why you think Bitcoin is the superior technology from a pragmatic truth perspective than, say, Ethereum, but also other crypto like Bitcoin Cash, like other hard forks of Bitcoin, and or maybe things that tools yet to be invented?
Yeah. So this is a good point of argument because a lot of people have countered me and said Bitcoin cannot be absolute scarcity because you can fork it and create something with the same properties as Bitcoin or potentially even better properties, right? You can create something with a deflationary monetary policy. That's what Bitcoin Cash was, actually. It forked Bitcoin with all of the same properties except for the block size that we alluded to earlier. The problem is that money is valued. Again, it's the good with a configuration of demand that is predominantly marketability. Mm-hmm. So it is valued based on its liquidity. That is, how many other trading partners are there in that monetary network? So it is a network valued because of its liquidity and network effects. So any new entrant into the market for money is incentivized to always choose the money with the deepest liquidity and the most network effects. Mm-hmm. This is why money has tended to be a winner-take-all market, because it's essentially a single-purpose tool, right? It is a tool if we consider that tools are time-saving devices, right? The shovel lets you dig more holes per man-hour than you can with your bare hands. Money is a tool, there's yet another definition of money, that lets us calculate, negotiate, and execute trades more quickly. So that function tends to coalesce towards one solution. And so the short answer would be that for the same reasons, quantifiable reasons, right? Like inflation resistance and liquidity and network effects, that we have one analog gold, we're only likely to have one digital gold. And I think the Bitcoin Cash fork proves that out empirically. It's a good case study because
it's one case study, right? But so that's really well put. So like gold was sticky. Once it was accepted, the network effects, the winner take all took over. And here's a fundamentally different kind of like analog versus digital is a leap in technologies.
That's right.
And you're suggesting that there's unlikely to be other leaps of that kind into a whole nother kind of space of technologies.
I would argue that Bitcoin is kind of like the ideological synthesis of gold, taking the monetary properties of gold and combining them with the internet itself.
Right.
And in doing so, it has essentially perfected the properties of money, right? You can't get more divisible, durable, recognizable, portable, or scarce than Bitcoin. So Satoshi has he left no design space for a superior technology to intercede and outcompete Bitcoin at this point, now that it's established liquidity and the
far superior technology, right?
Yeah, but it's a combination of the tech itself and the social layer that is coalesced to it.
You can't separate those two out.
That's right.
They're all connected, and then the political as well. I mean, but the portability, for example, that's another way to phrase that is what is it? The scaling. So the number of transactions, that's a limitation for Bitcoin that many argue is a feature, many argue is a bug. You have a bunch of cryptocurrency technologies that are able to achieve much higher, much faster frequency of transactions, much more transactions, all that kind of stuff. What are your thoughts on that? The low level of transactions that's possible with Bitcoin. Do you think that's a feature? Do you think that's a bug?
Necessary for security, actually. And even these other crypto assets that settle more quickly, they settle with less assurance of finality. So Nick Carter has a great piece on this actually called "It's the Settlement Assurance is Stupid." It's really good, where the gist of it is that there is more work being done in each block of Bitcoin that it is less vulnerable to reversion. So it's giving you higher degrees of assurance that your settlement or your trade has occurred with finality, whereas other blockchains are much more vulnerable. And again, with Bitcoin, the evolutionary path of money with gold is that it was first used as a collectible. It then became used as a store of value. After it had stored enough value, it began to be used as a medium of exchange. And then finally, when it was used widely enough as a medium of exchange, it becomes a unit of account. We actually start to think in the money. Bitcoin's following a similar path. So started out as kind of a collectible. Today, I would argue it's a store of value, one of the most effective store of value we've ever seen. So that evolutionary path that Bitcoin's following is similar to gold. First a collectible, today is store of value. To be an effective store of value, it has to optimize for supply cap.
Yes.
That has to be the first, and this is all Bitcoin really needs to do to be successful, by the way. Exactly what it's been doing for 12 years, virtually flawlessly, which is keep creating a block every 10 minutes and keep enforcing a supply cap of 21 million. As long as those two things hold, it is sound money, the ultimate sound money, the most inflation-resistant money there's ever been. It's actually completely immune. It's taken unexpected inflation to 0%. We know with perfect certainty what Bitcoin supply will ever be. For it to be used more broadly as a medium of exchange, it can't make trade-offs at the base layer to increase its portability, for instance. Even though portability is maybe kind of a misnomer because Bitcoin has extremely high portability, just doesn't have extremely high transaction throughput. Right. So we could say you can move it pretty quickly anywhere in the world as long as you're willing to bid up for the block space. But you can't satisfy all the world's economic volume. You can't do 300 million transactions per second like you can on a centralized database like Visa. But Bitcoin needs to be it has to be a store of value first before it can be a medium of exchange. So it has to protect the supply cap first before making any trade-offs for that. And I would argue that that's why Bitcoin is so rigid, is that it's optimized for survivability and optimized for that supply cap. And it's pushing experimentation and other features that would increase its transaction throughput to higher layers. So I think Lightning Network is something that's very interesting. It's still early, but there's a lot of throughput already being used on the Lightning Network. And it makes some slight trade-offs in terms of the trust minimization of Bitcoin. You end up trusting these smart contracts instead to move the Bitcoin, but you pick up nearly unlimited transaction throughput. So that's how biology evolves. That's how the internet evolved. It evolves in layers. So I think Bitcoin, you can sort of conceive of it as the latest layer to the internet, and it's one that preserves this store value property better than any asset we've ever had.
Let me ask sort of a critical question of, if you're wrong about your statements about Bitcoin, you find out years from now that you were wrong, what would that look like? What would be the things that make you realize you were wrong? Likely ideas or crazy out there ideas? Do you think about this kind of stuff?
All the time.
Because you speak very confidently about Bitcoin. And one of the things, let me put it this way, I think certainty, I feel like that's like a stoic statement. Certainty leads to ruin, something like that. Like certainty, I think, is an antithesis to progress often. And especially in your writing, but this is true for the Bitcoin community, there's a certainty about the Bitcoin. And that makes me very skeptical, no matter how good the ideas are. Whenever things are good, this might be the Russian in me. I think like, what are the ways this is going to go wrong? So what do you think are the ways this might go wrong, or you're wrong in your conception of what Bitcoin is?
Yeah, so science evolves via negativa, meaning that we're not proving hypotheses, and that's what becomes the body of science. Science is whatever is left over as we disprove hypotheses, right? Whatever we can empirically, through experimentation, disprove gets discarded, and whatever remains, whatever theory remains that hasn't been disproven is science, effectively. This process is similar to market actors zeroing in on a store value, right? They're experimenting with different forms of storing wealth across time. Some do better than others, and eventually everyone ends up on the one that is best. That's what gold was. In terms of understanding Bitcoin, I look at it as a similar approach. And that is the main question I'm asking myself is, how do you stop this thing? How do you turn it off? How do you end it? If you're a nation state, particularly, who has the most to lose in this transition, what is the attack vector by which they neutralize Bitcoin? I mean, that is the $250 trillion question. Mm-hmm. And, I've spent 5 years thinking about this thing very deeply. I've read everything on monetary history I can get my hands on. The general thought of how it is stopped, and this is the snag point that a lot of people get to in their explorations down the rabbit hole, is they just say the government will never allow it. And that becomes kind of their bottom. It's like, all right, Bitcoin's interesting, it's superior money, blah, 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 but the government will never allow it. And they said,
was Ray Dalio, did he say that?
Dalio was currently stuck there, yeah.
So Ray Dalio said that Bitcoin seems to be too promising.
Yeah.
If it is in fact as promising as it looks, governments are going to, I don't forget what the exact quote is, but not allow it. Ban it.
Yeah.
Governments will ban it. So how do you get Ray Dalio unstuck from your perspective?
Well,
and how do you get unstuck from that idea that how do you prevent governments from stopping a thing that threatens centralized power?
Well, Bitcoin is an idea. So governments that are really good at fighting centralized threats to their power, right? Whether that's a currency counterfeiter or a competing nation state or a business they don't like or an individual they don't like, they can kill them, they can throw them in jail, they can use any number of coercive or violent tactics to suppress it. But how do you point a gun at an idea? How do you coerce an idea? And that's, there is some anecdotal history here where there's the PGP case, which in the United States, the court was trying to classify it as munitions when we were shipping this pretty good privacy software overseas. Government wanted to classify it as munitions and restrict that exportation. And this was a circuit court case precedent when the PGP attorneys actually printed out the source code on paper and presented it as evidence in the court. All of a sudden it became protected under freedom of speech, and that it's just code is speech, code is language, and therefore, at least in the United States, it's protected under the First Amendment. I think a government ban would be largely unenforceable, frankly, on Bitcoin. Being that it's pure information, if you suppress market actors from using it in one jurisdiction, you're just creating incentives for them to go elsewhere. And you're actually increasing the incentives for other jurisdictions to be favorable towards it, because then they can create they get to benefit from the tax revenue and the businesses and the innovation that's occurring in and around Bitcoin as a result.
So you don't think if a particular central bank, like in Europe or United States, bans it, not maybe using those terms, but in some kind of way, you think that provides a really strong incentive for the other big players to enable it?
That's right. And that they're more likely, by the way, and governments know this, by the way, too. The other thing that causes a government to shoot itself in the foot is that if they ban something, they draw a lot of attention to it.
Yeah.
People are smart. I mean, people ask why. Why would a government ban it? Why can't I use this? So that's kind of typically be the last arrow in their quiver. They may try to ban it if Bitcoin, really starts to monetize very quickly, and the power structures that they impose today start to dissolve faster than others might think they will. Then they might try and ban it, but I think that ban will be largely unenforceable. They're more likely to tax it, which they already do tax it. They're likely to increase taxation of it. They're likely to try and make it more white market by actually tracing Bitcoin, seeing who has it, attaching identities to Bitcoin ownership, and making sure that they're getting their pound of flesh on all the transactions it results in. But I don't think, the other thing about this is, so we saw the internet outcompete intranets. In that we could say that open source networks tend to outcompete closed source networks. And there's a really good reason for this. And it's because in a closed source network, there are costs associated with defending the network itself. So the network owners, the owners of the closed source network, have to expend resources protecting it from competitors, and they have to expend resources imposing its rules, because they're not voluntarily adopted rules. So you actually have to impose these rule sets. Whereas an open source network, which is something much more akin to capitalism, pure in its pure sense, these are voluntarily adopted rules. So all market participants have agreed and consented to this rule set. So there's no enforcement cost and there's no turf protection, because anyone can freely enter or exit the open network. For that energetic reason, I think open networks outcompete closed networks typically. And in the digital age, that's why I think that's why internet outcompetes intranet, and that's why open source networks are going to eat closed source networks. So what Bitcoin would be in that lens is the ultimate open source monetary network devouring closed source central bank monetary networks. And I just don't see how there's no possibility of unilaterally stopping Bitcoin or destroying it. So then they're more likely to regulate or tax it. And again, the other fallacy here is that a lot of people tend to think of governments as these singular, indivisible entities, like that just move under one plan. But in reality, it's a lot of people, right? And a lot of people with loosely coupled interests and agendas and whatnot. Regulators and others, wearing their citizen hat, they're going to see this thing monetizing. They're going to be on the front lines of trying to regulate it, trying to control it. And I think what's likely to happen is they're going to start to adopt it, to buy some of it, even as an individual, or possibly even ultimately at a central bank or sovereign wealth fund level, as an insurance policy against its success. And once you start to acquire something and then you have a vested economic interest in its monetization, I think it kind of dissolves any of the power structures that are arrayed against it from the inside. So I've written a lot about this in a new series called Sovereignism, which is based loosely on a book called The Sovereign Individual. And that's the general thesis, is that microprocessing technology would devour our organizational models, the most important of which is the nation state. So I think we're going into this world where coercion and violence is just much less rewarding. The economics of violence are declining because of the low cost of protecting property, right? You can now protect your monetary property in Bitcoin at orders of magnitude less cost than is necessary to run a banking network. So it changes the way we organize ourselves. And again, if we zooming back to gold as kind of the original governor to governments, where if they manipulated the money, gold would leave their country. Mm-hmm. That's why governments have taken relatively concerted action to go off of the gold standard. There's a great book on this called The Gold Wars that outlines how governments have been waging a cold war against gold for the past 50 years. Bitcoin sort of renews hope for that free market governor of governments, and that is this digital gold that governments cannot stop or co-opt. So I think it's something, that's why I think it's such a big deal, is that it is changing. It's a new useful fiction, you might say, a useful fiction that's superordinate to the mythology of the nation state and government as the dominant institution in the world.
Well, I hope you're right that all forms of centralized power start breaking apart naturally. So governments, the more and more power is given to the individual, whatever the technology is. And Bitcoin seems to be a promising technology that empowers that, enables that. Mm-hmm. That seems to be the trend. And that's a promising trend from at least from a perspective of somebody who values this particular biological meat bag that's full of consciousness.
I think Bitcoin is exposing the greatest scam in human history, which is political authority. Like, who gives anyone the right to have political authority over anyone else? People should be free to adopt the rules and systems and tools that best suit their needs. And that arc of history we covered earlier, where as socioeconomic systems have become more favorable towards individual sovereignty, the more wealthy we have become. The more we have given the individual, we've maximized individual choice, the more wealth that society has created, and the more it has outcompeted the systems that have come before it. The latest would be, capitalism triumphing over socialism.
Before maybe we eat, you are in Texas, you brought over some brisket. Before we maybe indulge in that, let me bring up one quick topic, and then we'll take a break. And the topic of what some may term the toxicity of the Bitcoin community. That you've written that Bitcoin toxicity is tough love. Do you want to break that apart a little bit? Sort of the idea, the philosophy of the toxicity that's seems to be present in part in the Bitcoin community.
Yeah, we were talking about this a little bit before we recorded, and I've been through the gauntlet with Bitcoin toxicity as well. I came into this space professionally in 2017. I was originally running a multi-strategy crypto asset hedge fund. And my initial investment thesis on the world was that, Bitcoin was a big deal, but there were all these other exciting coins and projects and ways the technology was going to be used. And that view of reality met this I guess you could say as an ideological immune system, this Bitcoin toxicity, and that it's kind of a filter that's trying to catch bad or useless or even scamming ideas that this space is very well known for. As we've touched on today, Bitcoin, in my opinion, is this world-shattering innovation, but it's in a sea of the most scammy stuff ever, right? Anybody can go and create a coin. So you can go and launch one immediately online, and you can throw up a website, an advisor page, post a white paper talking about how great your technology is going to be and how it's going to change the world. And then you can raise $30 million in Bitcoin or Ethereum in 30 seconds kind of thing. So it's drawn in a lot of this scam artistry, you might say. And I think people living through that, because there is this natural predilection for people when they first come into Bitcoin, you're excited about it. Then you get lost in the shitcoin universe. And then just looking at the market success of Bitcoin versus, and when I use the word shitcoin,
you say with all the love in the world.
All the love in the world. I guess you could call me a toxic maximalist in some ways. Although I consider myself a freedom maximalist, not a Bitcoin maximalist.
Yeah, I saw that line. That's a good line.
Bitcoin, tracking the market success of Bitcoin versus alternative crypto assets, the signal is very clear that Bitcoin has outcompeted all of them. So I think that Bitcoin cultural toxicity has evolved as an immune response to those bad ideas, which is actually, if you think about it, kind of is a tough love, right? You don't want new entrants to the space to get lost in shitcoin jungle and learn the hard way, the way many Bitcoin maximalists have, that the real innovation is Bitcoin. But like an immune system, I think it can also go too far. And so I think it's useful when it is defending the space from false narratives, we might say, but it becomes detrimental when it's attacking people that are inquiring about Bitcoin or people that are approaching Bitcoin with a good spirit and good intention and a desire to learn. Because then at that point, it's actually impeding the free flow of ideas, which, the example in your clip that was totally taken out of context. And then you're literally just saying, I'm here to learn and contribute. I think I've got some stuff to do. And then people attack that. Like, that doesn't make any fucking sense. It's like you're attacking someone who's approaching it in a good spirit and asking questions.
Yeah, and I think sometimes talking about it, the toxicity in the Bitcoin community as an immune response, has a negative effect of giving it a pass. Because like it almost says, look, it equates it with the human immune system, which seems to do a really good job. And so you could say that the toxicity has a lot of features in the sea of fraudulent projects that steal money from people. It's really useful to make sure that you give people the harsh truth about who is and isn't a scammer. You have to take it apart, take it away from that metaphor of the immune system and look at basic human nature. And human nature can go to some dark places, which is, it's sad to say that some people, maybe many of us, can enjoy for its own sake the toxicity, the mockery, the derision. And you stop being part of the immune system that makes a successful idea propagate and start being a sort of a destructive virus yourself. And that's something I think about because I am new to this particular immune system, but I've explored other immune systems. And I think you understand this world much better than me, but I tend to prefer sort of love as a mechanism for spreading ideas, to err on the side of love and kindness, and almost like open-mindedness in a way where you're constantly lowering yourself in the face of other ideas, constantly questioning yourself. But I think I understand that that might be more applicable in certain contexts, like maybe in the space of science or something like that. But in the space of Bitcoin, as it currently stands, there's so many people that are trying to scam others out of their money that the kind of harshness required is different. Nevertheless, I do want to put it on people like yourself and others who I know you wouldn't consider yourself this, but you're one of the faces or leaders in this space, to call people out a little bit, to inspire them to be more loving, I suppose. But it's difficult because you want to walk that line carefully. You don't want to be too loving and open-minded. Otherwise, your brain falls out. I get it. It's a difficult balance to walk.
It is subtle and it's nuanced and it is difficult to walk. And I think that's why I try to say tough love, because when we're young, we may have certain ideas about the way we want our life to go, but then maybe our parents are not letting us do certain things and we think I know when I was a kid, I wanted to get my